In the rugged frontier of 1870s Montana, two powerful ranching families, the Kellys and the McCords, have been locked in a bitter feud for over a decade. What began as a dispute over water rights has escalated into violence, threatening to destroy both families. When young cattle rustlers exploit the chaos between the feuding clans, the situation reaches a breaking point. In a desperate attempt to end the bloodshed, Patriarch Thomas Kelly offers his spirited daughter Margaret in marriage to his sworn enemy, Jacob McCord. But when the two meet face to face, Jacob asks only one unexpected question that will change everything. Not about dowries or land, but about Margaret's own heart and dreams. This is a story of courage, unexpected love, and the power of choosing peace over vengeance in the untamed American West. Before we begin this tale of the frontier, please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy stories of the Old West. Subscribe to our channel for more historical narratives, and let us know in the comments which state or country you're watching from. We love hearing from our global audience of Western story enthusiasts. The Montana sun blazed mercilessly over the Kelly ranch as Margaret Kelly stood on the wooden porch, her calloused hands gripping the weathered railing. The summer of 1874 had been unforgiving, and the drought made every drop of water precious as gold. Through the shimmering heat waves, she could see her father's prize cattle gathering around the dwindling creek that marked the boundary between Kelly land and McCord territory. "Margaret!" Thomas Kelly's voice boomed from inside the ranch house, carrying the weight of a man who had fought for every acre of this land. "Come inside, girl. We need to talk." At 22, Margaret had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her late mother's sharp intelligence. She had spent her life learning to rope cattle, mend fences, and shoot straight, skills that served her well in this harsh land where weakness meant death. Her auburn hair, usually braided practically down her back, caught the light as she turned toward the house, her green eyes reflecting both curiosity and wariness. The Kelly ranch house, built from local timber and Montana stone, had stood for 15 years against prairie winds and bitter winters. Inside, the main room bore the scars of frontier life, bullet holes from Sioux raids, burn marks from a kitchen fire, and the worn furniture that spoke of a family that valued function over form. Thomas Kelly sat heavily in his leather chair, his weathered face etched with lines that seemed deeper today than they had yesterday. "Sit down, daughter," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His voice carried an unusual gentleness that immediately put Margaret on edge. "What's troubling you, Pa?" she asked, settling into the chair but keeping her spine straight, ready to spring into action if needed. Thomas removed his hat, revealing graying hair that had once been as red as his daughter's. "The McCords hit our south pasture again last night. Took 20 head of cattle." Margaret's jaw tightened. The feud between the Kellys and McCords had claimed her older brother's life 3 years ago, and the wound still festered in her heart like an infected cut. "How many men did we lose?" "None, praise God. But that's because young Jimmy Peterson was smart enough to run instead of fight." Thomas leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "Margaret, this can't go on. We're bleeding cattle, bleeding money, and sooner or later, we're going to be bleeding more good men." "So what are you saying, Pa? That we should just let Jacob McCord steal us blind?" The name of their enemy hung in the air like smoke from a prairie fire. Jacob McCord, tall, dark, and dangerous as a cornered rattlesnake. Margaret had seen him only once across the main street of Sweetwater Creek during a tense standoff between the two families. Even from a distance, his presence had been commanding, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with the alertness of a predator. Thomas stood and walked to the window that overlooked their land. "I've been thinking about your mother a lot lately, Margaret, about what she would want for this family, for this land." "Ma would want us to fight," Margaret said firmly. "She never backed down from anything." "Your mother was the smartest woman I ever knew," Thomas replied, his voice soft with memory. "And she knew that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose peace over war." He turned to face his daughter, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that frightened her more than any McCord raid. Resignation, mixed with desperate hope. "Pa, what are you planning?" Thomas took a deep breath, the sound echoing in the quiet room like the whistle of wind through canyon walls. "I'm going to end this feud, Margaret, once and for all." "How?" "By offering Jacob McCord something he wants more than our cattle, more than our water rights, more than revenge itself." Margaret felt her blood turn cold as understanding dawned. "Pa, no. I'm going to offer him your hand in marriage." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo her shock. "You can't be serious, Pa." You're talking about selling me like a prize heifer. Thomas's face hardened, the gentle father disappearing behind the mask of a man who had survived decades on the frontier. I'm talking about saving this family, this ranch, and every man who rides for the Kelly brand. How many more graves are we going to dig before you understand that? Margaret began pacing the room like a caged mountain cat, her boots striking the floor with sharp, angry steps. There has to be another way. We could sell off some of the herd, move the cattle to the north pasture, and then what, wait for McCord to follow us there? Thomas's voice rose, matching his daughter's intensity. This feud started before you were born, girl, and it'll outlast us both unless we do something drastic. But marriage, Pa? To him? Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. Jacob McCord killed Danny. Have you forgotten that? The mention of her brother's name hung between them like a ghost. Danny Kelly had been gunned down during a cattle raid, shot in the back while trying to protect the family's prize bull. The killer had never been identified, but everyone knew it had been one of McCord's men. Thomas's shoulders sagged, and suddenly, he looked every one of his 58 years. I haven't forgotten anything, Margaret. I see your brother's face every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep. But I also see the faces of the men still breathing, still depending on us to keep them alive. Margaret stopped pacing and stared out the window at the vast expanse of Kellyland. In the distance, she could see the hands working with the horses in the breaking pen, their movements careful and practiced. These men had families, children who depended on the wages Thomas Kelly paid them. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy woolen coat. What makes you think McCord would even consider such an arrangement? She asked quietly. Because he's not a fool, and neither am I. This feud is bleeding him dry, too. Last month, he lost his best foreman in a shootout with our boys. Before that, it was 2 of his ranch hands. Jacob McCord is many things, but he's not a man who wastes resources on a fight he can't win. Margaret turned from the window, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and curiosity. And you think I'm a resource worth trading for peace? I think you're worth more than all the cattle in Montana, Thomas said, his voice gentle again. But I also think you're smart enough to understand what's at stake here. Before Margaret could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air outside. Both Kellys moved instinctively toward the window, hands reaching for the guns at their sides. Through the dust cloud, they could see their foreman, Pete Hutchinson, riding hard toward the house, his horse lathered with sweat. "Boss," Pete called out as he reined in his mount near the porch. "We got trouble at Willow Creek." Thomas stepped outside, Margaret close behind him. Pete Hutchinson was a grizzled veteran of the frontier, a man who had seen enough violence to last 3 lifetimes. The worry lines around his eyes spoke of serious trouble. "What happened, Pete?" "Rustlers hit the McCord herd during the night, made off with near 50 head. But here's the strange part. They left behind a Kelly branding iron still hot from the fire." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Someone's trying to frame us." "That's what I'm thinking, Miss Margaret. But Jacob McCord ain't likely to see it that way. Word is he's gathering his men and heading this way with blood in his eyes." Thomas Kelly stepped off the porch, his hand resting on his gun belt. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe an hour, maybe less. He's riding with 12 men, all armed and looking for a fight." Margaret watched her father's face transform as he processed this information. The man who had just been discussing marriage arrangements became the hardened rancher who had survived Indian raids and outlaws. But she could also see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was weighing options like a chess player studying the board. "Pete, gather the boys and prepare the defenses, but tell them to hold their fire unless I give the word." "Boss, they're coming for a fight." "Maybe they are," Thomas interrupted. "But today might just be the day we give them something they weren't expecting instead." He turned to Margaret, his eyes intense and determined. "Get cleaned up, daughter. Put on your best dress." "Pa, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that sometimes the best way to face your enemy is to walk right up to him and offer him exactly what he wants before he knows he wants it." An hour later, Margaret stood in her bedroom, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror that had belonged to her mother. The emerald green dress, saved for special occasions, felt foreign against her skin after months of wearing practical riding clothes. Her hands trembled as she pinned up her auburn hair, leaving loose curls to frame her face the way her mother used to do. "Margaret," Thomas's voice carried up the stairs. "They're here." Through her window she could see the dust cloud approaching from the east. 12 riders in tight formation, moving with deadly precision. At their head rode Jacob McCord, unmistakable by his commanding posture, and the black stallion that matched his dark reputation. Margaret descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the suddenly quiet house. The Kelly Ranch hands had taken defensive positions, but as instructed, their weapons remained holstered. The tension was thick enough to cut. Thomas waited in his best suit, the same one he had worn to her mother's funeral. Despite the gravity of the situation, Margaret felt pride at how distinguished her father looked. "Remember, daughter," he said quietly as approaching horses grew louder. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust in something bigger than your own fear. And sometimes the bravest thing is admitting when you're making a terrible mistake," Margaret replied, but there was no real anger in her voice anymore, only resignation and strange curiosity. The thunder of hooves stopped outside, replaced by jingling spurs and creaking leather. Through the window, Margaret caught her first clear glimpse of Jacob McCord as he dismounted. He was taller than she remembered, with broad shoulders that filled his dark coat. His black hair touched his collar, speaking of a man who cared more about practicality than appearances. When he turned toward the house, Margaret saw the face that had haunted her nightmares. Angular features carved by sun and wind, and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Kelly!" Jacob's voice carried across the yard, deep and commanding. "Come out here and face what you've done." Thomas straightened his shoulders and walked to the door, pausing only to glance back at his daughter. "Stay inside until I call for you." Margaret watched through the window as her father stepped onto the porch, hands visible and empty. The Kelly Ranch hands remained at their posts, fingers hovering near their weapons. Jacob McCord stood 20 feet from the porch, his men flanking him in a semicircle. His hand rested on his Colt .45, but he hadn't drawn it. "McCord," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly. "You're a long way from home." "Not as far as I'd like to be from the man who stole my cattle," Jacob replied, dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face. 50 head, Kelly. 50 head with your branding iron left behind like a calling card. I didn't take your cattle, Jacob, and I think you know that." A murmur ran through the McCord riders, but Jacob raised his hand for silence. "Then explain why we found a Kelly iron at the site." "Because someone wants us to kill each other," Thomas said simply. "And we've been obliging them for too long." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying, old man?" "I'm saying this feud has cost both our families too much blood, too much money, and too much pain. I'm saying it's time to end it. And how do you propose we do that? You going to give me back my cattle and throw in your best horses as an apology?" Thomas took a step forward, his voice growing stronger. "I'm going to give you something worth more than cattle, more than land, more than all the water rights in Montana." Jacob's hand tightened on his gun. "Keep talking. I'm going to give you my daughter's hand in marriage." The words fell into silence like stones into a deep well. Margaret saw Jacob McCord's entire body go still, his dark eyes widening with surprise. Around him, his men shifted restlessly, uncertain how to react to this unexpected turn. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Jacob's eyes found the window where Margaret stood, and their gazes locked across the distance. Even through the glass, she could feel the intensity of his stare, the way he seemed to be looking directly into her soul. "Your daughter," Jacob said slowly, his voice carrying a strange note Margaret couldn't identify. "You're offering me, your daughter?" "I am." Jacob was quiet for another long moment, his eyes still fixed on the window where Margaret stood. Then he did something that surprised everyone present, including his own men. He laughed. Not the bitter laugh of a man mocking his enemy, but something else entirely. A sound that held surprise, irony, and perhaps even a hint of genuine amusement. The laughter died quickly, replaced by an expression Margaret couldn't read from her position at the window. "Thomas Kelly," Jacob said, shaking his head slowly. "You are either the bravest man in Montana or the biggest fool." "Maybe both," Thomas replied. "But I'm also a man who's tired of burying good people." Jacob looked toward the window again, his gaze finding Margaret's. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly enough for her to hear every word. "Before I consider your offer, Kelly, I have just one question." The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Margaret held her breath, her heart pounding. Jacob McCord's dark eyes remained fixed on the window where she stood, and she felt he could see straight through the glass into her thoughts. "What's your question?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the tension. Jacob dismounted slowly, taking several steps closer to the porch. His men shifted restlessly behind him, but Jacob seemed completely at ease despite being outnumbered on Kelly land. "My question isn't for you, Kelly," Jacob said. "It's for her." He looked directly at the window where Margaret stood, and she felt exposed, as if he could see everything she was thinking and feeling. "Miss Kelly," Jacob called out, his voice reaching her through the glass. "I need you to come out here." Thomas started to protest. "Now see here, McCord." "No." Jacob's voice cut through the air like a blade. If we're going to discuss marriage, then the lady in question deserves to have a voice in the matter, don't you think? Margaret felt her breath catch. In all the conversations about marriage arrangements, no one had ever suggested that her opinion might matter. Men didn't typically ask women what they wanted. They simply decided and expected compliance. "Margaret," Thomas called up to her. "Come down here, daughter." Taking a deep breath, Margaret smoothed her emerald dress and walked to the door. When she stepped onto the porch, the afternoon sun caught her auburn hair, setting it ablaze with copper highlights. Jacob McCord removed his black hat, a gesture of respect that surprised her. Up close, he was even more imposing than she remembered, but there was something in his dark eyes she hadn't expected, a hint of gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. "Miss Kelly," he said, his voice softer now, "your father has made me an interesting proposal. He's offered your hand in marriage to end the feud between our families." Margaret lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm aware of that, Mr. McCord. Are you also aware that such an arrangement would make you my wife, bound to live on McCord land, subject to my protection and my authority?" The words should have frightened her, but something in his tone suggested he was testing her rather than threatening her. "I understand the implications of marriage, Mr. McCord." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'm sure you do. You strike me as a woman who understands a great deal." The compliment, unexpected and genuine, sent a flutter through Margaret's chest. "My question is this," Jacob continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "If I were to accept your father's proposal, would I be gaining a wife who comes to me willingly, or would I be taking a woman against her will?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Margaret was aware of every person watching her, waiting for her answer. Her father's future, the lives of their ranch hands, the end of years of bloodshed, all of it balanced on her words. But Jacob McCord was asking her what she wanted, not what was expected, not what duty demanded, but what she, Margaret Kelly, actually desired. "Mr. McCord," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice, "may I ask you a question in return?" Jacob nodded, his dark eyes showing genuine interest. "If I came to you willingly, would you be gaining a wife you actually wanted, or would you simply be accepting a solution to a problem?" This time Jacob's smile was real, not the bitter expression of a man mocking his enemy, but the genuine smile of a man who had just been pleasantly surprised. "Miss Kelly, I believe you just answered my question with a question of your own." "Did I?" "You did indeed." Jacob stepped closer to the porch. "And to answer your question, if you came to me willingly, I would be gaining exactly the kind of wife I never dared hope to find." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "What kind is that?" "The kind who isn't afraid to speak her mind, even to a man with my reputation. The kind who can look danger in the eye and ask it questions instead of cowering. The kind who understands that sometimes the most important battles are fought with words instead of bullets." Margaret looked at this man who had been her family's enemy for as long as she could remember, seeing him clearly for the first time. Behind the fearsome reputation, she saw intelligence, respect, and something that looked surprisingly like loneliness. "In that case, Mr. McCord," she said, stepping forward to the edge of the porch, "I accept your proposal." Jacob's smile widened, transforming his entire face. "I haven't made one yet." "Then you'd better hurry up. A lady doesn't like to be kept waiting." Jacob McCord threw back his head and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that echoed across the yard. When he looked at Margaret again, his eyes were bright with something that might have been joy. "Margaret Kelly," he said, removing his hat completely and placing it over his heart, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "I will," Margaret replied, and as the words left her lips, she realized she meant them completely. Behind Jacob, his men began to relax, hands moving away from their weapons. The tension that had gripped the yard began to dissipate like morning mist. "Well then," Jacob said, turning to address both families, "it seems we have a wedding to plan and a feud to bury." As Margaret watched the man who would become her husband shake hands with her father, she realized that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in fighting your enemies. It was in having the wisdom to recognize when they might become something more. "Andy,"